Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Follycast, the podcast devoted to the rivers of London books. This is Margaret in Sutton,
Richard in Fulham,
Dan in Worcester,
and Jennie in Muswell Hill.
It only seems a few weeks ago that we embarked on our mission to read and discuss the Rivers of London series by Ben Aaronovitch, and here we are already on book 5, Foxglove Summer. We're already more than halfway through the 8-book series so far. No sooner did we start reading the book during the heatwave than the weather here turned distinctly autumnal.
Just a reminder that whilst Margaret and I are rereading the series, Jan and Jennie are reading for the first time, as are some of our listeners, so we won't discuss spoilers past the book we're reviewing.
So, Foxglove Summer in a nutshell.
Still reeling from Leslie's betrayal at the climax of Broken Homes, Peter heads west out of town to investigate potential supernatural links to the disappearance of two 11-year-old girls from the village of Rushpool in Herefordshire. It's a very different book to the first four, with London in the rearview mirror as soon as page 3, and many of our regular cast of characters only referenced or spoken to over the phone. Effectively, it's the Peter and Beverly show as we meet a new cast of locals.
It's a story that ties together changelings, unicorns, dogging, forest, steam traction engines, bees, fairy queens and Roman roads. Beverly and Peter spend a romantic night magically repopulating a river, and with regard to the missing girls, it's eventually a case of buy two, get one free. Peter takes up his pent-up feelings about Leslie on an unsuspecting tree, but an attempt to ensnare Leslie by text fails. Not only is she wise to the ploy, she leaves a chilling warning to Peter. Enjoy life while you can, because in a year things are really going to kick off. So what do we all make of Foxglove Summer? Let's start with the change of location. It's very different from the first 4 books. Is this refreshing or is it frustrating? Jennie, what do you think?
For me, it was frustrating, which made me realise how important London is to my whole enjoyment of the series. And it was frustrating not just because there was no London, but there was no Nightingale. And I realise now how important he is to my enjoyment of the books. I mean, there were lots of welcome things, but I just felt that we were on a little holiday break, a little rainy caravan spot in, where was it? Herefordshire. I didn't dislike it, and there were lots of really good things about it, but I wanted to be in London. I didn't want to go to this caravan site in Herefordshire.
This worked better for me than one of the earlier books when they just went out of London for part of the time. I thought this was a complete sort of Peter book, wasn't it, really? It was almost as if he'd sort of evolved in this one, I think, he'd obviously been traumatised by what had happened in the previous book. And so I thought that taking him away to a completely different environment and completely having the whole story in Herefordshire made more sense than when they were flitting out of London and back in. And so I know what you mean about missing London, but I thought they did this well, and I thought they made the countryside a sort of character and did make the contrasts, and the fact that everybody, all the characters there, seemed to be so much a part of that countryside that it painted a completely different canvas, which I quite enjoyed. I mean, it is clearly not too far from where I am. It's the next county along. But Herefordshire and Worcestershire are very different worlds, and Herefordshire is much more rural and unknown. So there's a sort of more of a mystery about that county, I think.
Richard?
I think with this book, I'm in the same boat as Peter, really. It's definitely a fish out of water story. I can go into some of my issues later on with regard to some aspects of the plot, which, to be honest, I just didn't understand some of the motivations around the abduction and how it was resolved. But overall, I definitely liked the book. I think it had an excellent sense of place and was a much needed change of pace. The atmosphere, the smell and the feel of high summer in the British countryside all come through really strongly. I think rereading the series, it does come across as a necessary punctuation point after the first 4 books. I know what Jennie means about the books being about London, but I think if all of the first 7 books were in London, it would be a bit relentless. Reminded a bit of one of my favourite Frank Sinatra songs, which goes, it's nice to go travelling, but it's so much nicer to come home. And he lists all the things he loves about Brooklyn when he returns back from his travels. And to a certain degree, I think the next book benefits from Foxglove Summer as a result. If it had come straight after Broken Homes, it wouldn't have had the same impact. So overall, really liked it. I guess there is the issue about books working well on their own as opposed to benefiting the series as a whole. I enjoy Foxglove Summer, but I do have some issues that I would like to discuss later.
I like to change of location, but as you know, up until this point, this was one of my favourite books. I like, following on from Richard, I think it could have been dealt with more, apart from when he gets his frustration out on a tree, that whole sense of grief of that lost relationship for Peter, which runs in the first part of the book until Leslie makes contact. But I quite liked it once it got going. I'm not quite sure about, there's some plot points that obviously we can talk about, but I quite like the fact of, this a Londoner out of his depths in the countryside, and although it's not the rivers of London, you do find quite a lot about nature and rivers specifically, but not specifically the rivers of London. So I quite liked it from that point of view, and some of the, not all of them, but some of the characters are quite interesting. But I don't mind it. I think maybe because I was quite, when I first read Broken Homes, I was like, oh my goodness, I quite like that sort of like, let's breathe, let's move on before we go to the next big chunk of what's happening in the Peter's story. But yeah, I do agree that it's very slight Nightingale, but Nightingale wanted him to go to the countryside. He thought he needed a break from London.
Absolutely, and he did, but I didn't necessarily want to go with him.
No.
It's interesting that we talk about the books a lot as a series, and there is this whole prevailing box set culture in TV at the moment, with whole seasons of shows being dumped down on Netflix at the same time. And that means for those shows, people can write episodes in a different way, as someone could go straight on to the next episode. I just wonder how people reading the series at the time they came out felt about waiting 18 months to find out what happened to Leslie, and then another 18 months to find out what happens after that. Whereas we, with our production schedule, we're reading 1 book a month, so we don't have that long to wait. I mean, clearly Margaret wasn't disappointed at the time because it's her favourite book, and I was okay. I don't remember putting it down and feeling frustrated or cheated. I sometimes wonder how writers are sometimes writing not just for the current audience, but also for posterity, when all the books are sitting there on a shelf as a complete series and the reader can just go straight on to the next one and off you go.
That isn't just a contemporary phenomenon. That Dickens didn't make people wait for the next episode for 18 months. It was a continuous, albeit without pictures, but it was, and sound. But, I think this feels as if it could well have been something that would have been available in the kind of Dickens model, that you would write frequent shorter episodes to keep the story going. But even then, you had to wait until the next book with Dickens. So you might get one whole series of episodes through in a short period of time, but then had to rethink what the next book was about.
Yeah, I think the first 3 Armistead Maupin Tales of the City books were originally released as individual chapters weekly in the San Francisco Chronicle.
I love those.
It's interesting that the next 3 Tales from the City books weren't released as individual chapters, I think, and as a result there's less of the page-turning excitement, but they're still pretty good, but structured in a very different way.
I just posit something else? And all the other books, we all sort of said that you could probably pick that book up and start from that point in the series and know what was going on and be fine about it. In this book, to a certain extent, you could from about page 100 onwards, but the whole backstory and Leslie and everything, there's not an awful lot of reference to that. So you really have to be committed by this point to appreciate
absolutely
where Peter's coming from.
And you get a very skewed view of the whole world in which they operated in if you were just looking at the kind of whole Fae issue and all of that kind of stuff. The presence of evil was not so marked there.
Well, nobody dies in this book.
Nobody dies, no.
No. If you think about the body count in some of the other books, it's we get one extra back. Just as a sort of side to that, what do you think about his writing of the countryside? Because obviously I feel when he is in London, you know, I can think, I know that Tesco, I know that place. Whereas for Jan, you're probably the best place to comment on this, because I think I've been through Hereford and out again in about 20 minutes on the way to somewhere else. Do you think he's as good as writing about the country as he is about London?
As I say, I don't know Herefordshire really, really well, but I do feel that sense when you're driving through Herefordshire that it is almost this other world. It doesn't feel like going into rural Sussex or Suffolk. There is definitely that sort of atmosphere about it, as if there might be things going on here that I don't quite understand. And obviously he was naming places that actually exist, which I thought again was good, because it wasn't just all made up places. Like when you're in London, you can visualize those places, or at least you can find them on a map. I thought they did a good job actually of that. And also the sense, I liked the way, for instance, Dominic, I liked the way that he was completely at home in that environment that he'd grown up in. He sort of claimed it when later in the book, when Peter is trying to say to Dominic, look, you don't need to get involved in this, you know, this might be a step too far. And Dominic says, no, this is my neighbourhood, this is my folklore. So I thought that was really good, how the new characters were fully rounded, I thought, in that they belonged to that place. Whereas Peter was there from London, and you couldn't really see these other characters fitting into the London scene in the same way.
But I felt he fitted in maybe a bit too easily. That I would have expected more kind of friction, or with the cops as well as with the people.
I know what you mean. The only thing I thought was that it seemed that whereas in earlier books, Peter's still very much the apprentice, and he seems to be doing slightly daft things that Nightingale questions. Here it seems as if Peter steps up a bit. So I don't know whether it was he fitted in because literally he was in charge here. He hadn't really got the same backup. I know Beverly arrives, but it's almost as if he's had to behave as if he's got that particular responsibility.
But he also follows the processes and the rules much more here, because everybody else is, I think. In fact, I was taken by the fact that even the chapter headings were all very process driven.
Yes, they were.
It was like a manual, a police manual of the order in which you do things. So he just kind of buckled up. Maybe he was just using that framework as a structure for himself to kind of get around all the other things he was thinking about Leslie and what had happened in the he kind of retreated into the bureaucracy of it all.
And I thought that Beverly sort of revealed that when she sensed he's bottling everything up, when she told him to just hit a tree or something.
I agree with you that he settles in quite quickly, but that almost needs the whole process of having a police procedure to deal with. And actually it is more complicated than he thinks, and the Nightingale doesn't really think it's going to amount to much, possibly. I do like the characters. I like Dominic very much. Nicole's quite interesting. I think his mum and the cowshed, all of that is quite, the Airbnb thing is hilarious. But I also think what is quite interesting, you talk about Peter's quite happy with the whole procedure thing and he does settle down, but Beverly's almost like that bridge for him. Because she seems very much at home in the countryside as she is in the city. She seems to be very quickly acclimatised to everything that's going on and connected with Melissa and Fred and the river. So that's all quite interesting in itself, that she can make that sort of connections that he might need as not only as his sidekick, but just sort of giving him a wider perspective of what might actually be going on.
Well, rivers are the same everywhere. So that was kind
exactly. Apart from the one that's not working, that they have to.
I didn't. Yeah, okay. No, let's not talk about that. I just so bizarre.
They had to invigorate the river.
I quite like the idea that the first time they get it together, it isn't a normal situation. It's surreal and magical, and even he isn't entirely sure what's happened the following day.
And it was also quite humorous, I thought, that they were then having to scrabble around to get clothes as well, afterwards. So.
It is majorly significant because Isis in the first book tells him that's the one thing you should never do, or be very wary if you get into the river with a goddess.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, well, you can go back and listen to the spoiler zone now that we did at the end of episode 1, about 15 minutes, where we did talk about that.
No, I don't know. I'm going to have to wait right until the bitter end before I listen to the spoiler section.
To return to Margaret's original question, I do think this book has a strong sense of place. And when we mentioned we were going to be reviewing Foxglove Summer, one of our listeners on Spotify, Nadine, got in touch, who's done some interactive maps that you can actually explore the locations using a pretty nifty piece of software. And it interacts with things like Street View and Google Maps. So you can actually look at an individual piece of text that she's highlighted about a location or an event, and then see actually that on the map. Rushpool itself is based on the real village of Yarpole, and it's really interesting how much a lot of the locations do look very much as I imagine, particularly Pokehouse Wood, for example, and it works well for this book because obviously it's working in quite a limited area as opposed to many of the books that are dotted all over London. You can see the map and play around with it via the link that we'll put in the show notes, or you could just Google the Follypedia resource and look under the map section where you can find maps that other people have also uploaded as well for some of the other books. And it's all good stuff. Now, in our last episode covering Broken Homes, Jan was keen that the Leslie plot arc should not be put on hold for this book. She was very keen to find out what happened, whereas Jennie felt that probably it should to a certain degree to allow Peter to work through his feelings. So how do we feel about the author's decision here? I mean, clearly Leslie doesn't feature physically in the book, but the 6 texts she does send do seem to almost punch their way into the book, particularly given they're in bold. And it does add to that sense of alienation and distance. What's she thinking? What does she mean?
I mean, I'm intrigued by Leslie and Peter's relationship. So I did miss her not being there. But I think, again, because it was taken completely out of London, the whole book, none of it in London, and the pop-up messages that he kept getting, I think it kept the Leslie story alive, and it didn't seem wrong that she didn't appear in person because they were right out of London, away from where it had all happened. And there's still enough there that she's hinted at that you think there's still a lot to come from Leslie. Well, I'm hoping so anyway.
Jennie, you talked about police procedure and the chapters and everything. There was this little running commentary saying, oh my goodness, Leslie would have done this, or she said, you idiot, you should have done X or Z. So she's still in his head in terms of she was the better copper than he was, in the sense that she did everything by the book and ran everything. So there are quite a lot of specific references in terms of things that he maybe could have done better, or he should have handled it in a certain way. Yeah, having read it again, I didn't realise how few texts there were, but they all mean something quite significant. As you say, there's only 6, and I thought there was far more of that. And it's left to Nightingale and the police to handle that, and Peter just has to do what he has to do. But there was enough for me, I think, just to think there is a lot more coming, and you need that space. And presumably Leslie's got to have her face redone, or there needs time for Leslie to do whatever it is that Leslie was so, it was so important that she could ditch Peter.
I think it's really interesting that his first reaction every time he gets a text is to report it. He has a process that he needs to follow, which I think allows him to do 2 things. First of all, to get it away from him. So he does, in a way, he doesn't have to think about it. Because he has to do something with it, which is let them all know and let them get on with it. So in a way, it's a positive thing, and it's a way of him dealing with it. But then he's not really dealing with it. That's the problem. He's kind of shuffling off to one side, which is what Beverly spotted, that he's not kind of dealing with the emotional side of it at all. So I expect we'll see more of him still trying to deal with the emotional side, but maybe getting closer to her and not following the rules quite so much.
Yes, I think my initial reaction after the first message was one of surprise that he didn't try and just communicate with her alone to try and think, what's gone on? How are you? Why did you do what you did? But no, as you say, he just went straight and reported it.
And did what they told him to do.
Yeah, yeah.
But she must have known he would do that, I think. That's why I suspect that her texts were very carefully worded to him.
This really very strongly reminded me actually of an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, which followed probably one of the most famous two-part episodes, The Best of Both Worlds, which were a very traumatic story for Captain Picard, who's turned into a Borg and becomes the enemy briefly. And in the episode called Family, he returns back to his family's vineyard in France and works through his feelings. He doesn't attack a tree, but he does have a breakdown in a vineyard, and it is very much about how do we cope with what's happened in the preceding episode. So I think in that context, it works really well for me as a book. I think it's that, not just that punctuation point, but also that sense of coming to terms with what's happened and being in a different environment.
It's taken us 5 books, but Peter and Beverly are finally together. I mean, she doesn't turn up quite until about a good 100 pages or so into the book, but this is a huge story for Beverly. So how well do you think their relationship is handled in this book?
I think very well. It could have happened anywhere, but probably more likely to happen outside of the kind of sphere of Nightingale and the Folly and what have you. Well, my thinking is that she was sent there in the same way that Peter was sent there, in order to help him deal with what he was having to deal with. And she's a very smart cookie. She found all sorts of ways to get involved in what was going on locally. We needed her in the absence of Nightingale to fix things, especially fix the whatever was going on right at the end, which we'll probably come back to. And maybe it's better that it happened in Herefordshire because he was a fish out of water anyway, and she comes along and now there's a pair of fish out of water. So they're connected by something much more than they would have been in the heart of London, I think. So I enjoyed that, and it's really nice to see her back.
I like the fact that she's not really his sidekick, is she? She's really quite strong and independent minded, so that she'll help him out, but she's going to do it her way. So it's not as if he's telling her what to do. When he invites her on the unicorn hunt, whenever she's asked to do something, she takes charge. So she's not this submissive role. So I quite like, it's quite an unusual relationship, obviously, but no, I like how it works and how it's developed in this book, in the sense that you see much more interaction and they're working as a team, I think.
Okay, now in this book, Peter's not, for once, in his own environment, London. He's a stranger in a strange land. And as a result, I think we were aware of Peter's ethnic background more when he's removed from that urban environment. There are a few incidents of overt, implied, or, if we're being kind, accidental racism in the case of Dominic when he first meets Peter, I think. For me, in the first few books, the issue of race seems pretty much natural, whereas here it seems edgier. We have Peter writing after one encounter with some thugs, for example. I wanted to provoke them. I wanted to give them a smacking they wouldn't forget. Do you think that removing Peter from the melting pot of London and dumping him down in rural Herefordshire makes us more aware of how the author handles issues of race and diversity?
Well, I actually had some thoughts about the earlier books, that he is in the melting pot of London, but he's also in the Met, and the Met is not well known for its approach to racism and diversity. So I was surprised he wasn't getting more of that when he was in London. I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all that you get occasional comments when he's in Herefordshire. In fact, I'm surprised he didn't get a little more. I suspect that it hasn't become an issue. Was it deliberate? Was he deliberately sent to somewhere really remote with very low ethnic population to see how that panned out? I'm not sure what the intention was.
The author, you mean?
Yeah.
A lot of it comes from the police though, doesn't it? In the sense that they're quite pleased when his photograph is taken because that will increase diversity quota. And then they mention it again later on. There is that one incident in the supermarket, isn't there? With the two youths as well.
Yeah.
But Beverly's interaction with the police is quite limited, isn't it? Because her reaction is always through Peter on the whole. And Dominic, he's in and out of the Leinster.
One of the girls, is it Gabrielle, that's the friend of the two girls?
Yeah.
She asks him about the colour of his skin, doesn't she? Which I suppose the author is trying to suggest that, you know, it's not a diverse neighbourhood that she's from. So asks him directly, and he's hushed by her mother.
Yeah, I think it can be a trope in books and TV when urban characters are in the countryside that they write the rural characters from this kind of snobby, superior perspective as almost yokels. And I don't think that Ben Aaronovitch does that here. They aren't backward country folk. They are well-rounded characters. But Peter and, to a lesser degree, Beverly are having to adapt to a non-diverse context. Now, one of the things we haven't really commented on that I thought I'd bring up in the podcast so far is how well Ben Aaronovitch, a white author, writes non-white characters. As the four of us are white as well, I guess there is a limit to how much we can judge his success. But to me at least, it does seem natural from the start. It's interesting that authors often don't comment on white characters' colour, as that is the assumed default, but Peter inverts that. I'd also highly recommend, I thought I'd mention it now, an article by Alani Jolie Abbott that appeared in Den of Geek a while ago. It's called The Challenge of Crafting an Intersectional Narrator for the Rivers of London series. And it really does highlight how well Ben Aaronovitch handles issues around race, and I would recommend seeking it out. It also does feature a really interesting quote from Ben, which I'll read to you now. Way back when the books were but a twinkle in my eye and I was kicking around a TV format idea in my head by the name of Magic Cops, the protagonist was to have been called Simone. She, like Peter, would have been a young PC just finishing her probationary period and would have a friend-stroke-rival called Leslie, but unlike Peter, was a British woman of Jamaican descent. When I shifted to prose, I wasn't confident enough of my abilities to write a woman in close first person, which is a very intimate viewpoint. So Simone became a man, and around that time Peter Grant arrived in my head, complete with jazz legend father and Sierra Leonean mother. He's been stuck there ever since. So Peter originally would have been female.
It is a topic of much debate, the whole concept of cultural appropriation, but it tends to be more concerned with writing characters of different ethnic backgrounds. It used to be the case that men wouldn't really write women that often, and somebody who wrote very good women was kind of very notable. But the subject always seems to be about race rather than gender.
Well, as I said, I'll put the link in the show notes. It does contain mild spoilers for the upcoming book Lie Sleeping, but I'd recommend it nonetheless, and it's on the website called Den of Geek.
You're not surprised. You're not surprised to learn
That you hang around in the Den of Geek.
I do. It's a very good website. Very good website.
I'd quite like to talk about Hugh Oswald and also his daughter Melissa and their role in the book.
It was interesting to get a bit more background on Nightingale and what had happened, and to certainly get more detail about what had happened at Ettersburg and the fact that Nightingale had obviously been heroic in World War II and was admired by all of his colleagues, and the contribution that Nightingale's actions had to the creation of the Folly and the library, I thought was all fascinating. Now again, the granddaughter, I couldn't quite believe the connection between the granddaughter and Hugh. She seemed not exactly, but almost a bit Molly-ish, in the sense that she was part of her grandfather's life, in that she was there seemingly taking care of him, but then she had this other world going on that we didn't really get that much insight into. And the fact that she connected instantly with Beverly was also intriguing. So I liked Hugh Oswald's place. I thought I could picture him really well, and the background to Ettersburg and World War II. I felt I was a bit clearer about that. But Melissa, I was less clear about and convinced by.
I also assumed that she was being built up to play some vital role at the denouement, that she was a bit like Chekhov's gun, but she doesn't really appear towards the end at all. So I wasn't quite sure what the whole beekeeping thing contributed to the plot as a whole.
Do you not think she does?
I don't know, enlighten me.
Well, her connection with the bees, and there is a bee who comes out on a reconnaissance at the end of the book to actually check out what's going on the Roman road, and then after the bee comes Beverly.
Oh.
Yeah, and then the other thing I thought about, I went back and had a look. If you look at the description of how Melissa looks and how she's described in terms of the yellow and the black that she wears and her hair, I wonder whether she's got this. I mean, we know she has bees in her attic above her bedroom, don't we?
I think she's the queen bee.
I don't know, but I suddenly thought, it's just weird about the whole thing to do with bees, and the bees don't like foxgloves, and the bees are like a sort of barometer of what's actually happening. So I think they are actually significant in terms of being able to locate where Peter is. I think I could be wrong. I could be making a whole scenario here, but that was from a second read, I have to say, because I suddenly thought I couldn't see the point of her, as you say.
If that's true, then I missed all of that. I agree totally with Jan, and it's great to see some of these kind of old guys who've got the background, but they all seem a bit isolated and lonely, a bit like Nightingale. But I saw her as a bit Molly-like, but I didn't get the significance of the bees or the foxgloves, frankly. So I need to go back and read that.
Okay, well, I mentioned at the start that I had some issues understanding the plot around the abduction specifically. Now, I'm not trying to bring these up in the sense of trying to be pedantic or say, oh, I think the author's missed something here. And again, I would stress I did enjoy Foxglove Summer, but it's interesting that Jennie said during the Broken Homes podcast that it would have been better and more dramatic without the final chapter rounding things up, whereas here I actually felt it all ended too soon and I thought there's a final chapter missing. So I've got a few questions. At the risk of looking stupid in front of you and the listeners, who are undoubtedly far more clued in than I am.
I suspect I'm going to be adding to your question list.
Well, okay, well, let's see.
Why did the Fae swap the babies 10 years ago, or whenever it was? What was their reason for doing that? What was their motivation for swapping the babies?
I didn't feel that was answered in the book at all. I didn't really understand. It was quite intriguing, the fact that Zoe, the sister, had run away with the baby and that they'd obviously got swapped. So I thought there was going to be a big thing about the changelings. But it was just left as, well, that's something that happens. They just swap babies. And then when they came back, we're going to keep them all. And, they can just go and be looked after. And also there was something about the foxgloves. And that was sort of just thrown in as a sort of a sentence about foxgloves and changelings. But then it wasn't explained any further. No. And I guess because we're going back to London, we're never going to find out.
Maybe it was just all about giving Peter something new and different to solve and letting us know a bit more about where Molly comes from.
Absolutely, it does do that, but I wasn't sure what their motivations actually were.
I don't know why they did anything. I don't know why the unicorns. I don't know why the children were abducted.
Okay, next question. When they wanted to swap the girls back, why did they kidnap 2 girls for 4 days in order to do it?
You're asking the wrong person.
And they said, don't they, that it normally happens with a baby, a baby, which I presume is because then the parents won't notice.
Yeah.
I tried to find out a bit more about changelings because it's a whole genre of literature that I don't know anything about. It was the whole idea of that they swapped the babies over, so the changeling baby is brought up in a human world until a certain age. That is about as far as I could take it.
And that comes quite a lot into sort of magic, evil stuff. You want this child to be evil, but you want them to appear to be
Yeah.
So you unleash their evilness, and it's usually the other way around. You send an evil child into a good home,
Yeah.
so that they're there in the population.
But the Fae aren't evil, are they?
No,
And
so I don't know why they did anything.
If the duplicates had got different mothers but the same father, why did they look the same? Because the mother didn't notice when they were swapped originally, and then when they were swapped back again, why did they look the same?
And why did their eyes change colour?
Yes.
And Derek was the father of everyone, apparently.
He was.
That's the danger of setting these in kind of strange small country communities.
Sorry, Herefordshire.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can lose our rural listenership
Yes.
if we're not careful. Assuming we have quite one final thing before we do wrapping up thoughts. And I think this may be less of a sort of a thing we don't understand. It may be something that is more obvious, but having gone to the whole effort of trying to get, do all the swapping and get the kids back, why was the Queen of the Fae happy to take Peter instead? Why did she drop the whole scheme? She says, I'll come instead. She was like, yeah, right, effectively, yeah, right, we'll do that, that's better. So is it that she sensed some incredible power in Peter, or that they know who he is, or what were they going to do with him? Before Beverly rode to the rescue?
That might have forced Beverly to ride to the rescue. Would she have ridden to the rescue if the girls were the hostages?
No, probably not. But why did the Fae didn't want her to ride to the rescue, did they?
But you're right. There must have been something in Peter.
What were they going to do with him? Perhaps this is it's an ongoing series. Perhaps I think this falls more into intriguing. I think the other things we've talked about, were just head scratching. This is more sort of I wonder if that's going to pay off later on, because it might. Why are the Fae so interested in Peter? That effectively they'll drop the whole plot that they've been working on for the whole book to say, we'll have Peter instead.
They must sense, he had the staff, he must have a magic presence. They must have thought there's something that they want from Peter that's more important than taking back the changeling baby. They sensed that they could get something that was far more significant in terms of holding Peter hostage.
But
maybe
there didn't
Nightingale,
seem
I
to
don't
be
know.
any hint or suggestion of that. I think we can read all sorts of things into it,
Absolutely.
but I don't think there was any, textual evidence to explain why, they gave the others up and took him so willingly. And it was like, we've moved on now, that's it.
It's almost Beverly's the last line, which is hands off the boyfriend, isn't it? That's pretty much. Can I also mention that Richard noticed, I first read the book in hardback. And in the hardback, there is an extra chapter at the back, which is actually a short story. And it follows on the way back with Beverly and Peter in the car and somebody that they actually meet. It has nothing to do with the plot. It's to do with somebody that they meet and how they do it. And they have Nicole in the back of the car with them. The not Nicole. Who is the Nicole. And it's a short story, but it doesn't exist in any other of the books that are on the Kindle. And it's now in that collection of short stories that he's put out. But that gave me a little bit of symmetry in the sense that it starts with him going down the A40 and M40 past the Hoover building, and it finishes him in a car coming back with Beverly. If you take that to be an additional chapter of the book, which it isn't, but otherwise it literally just stops, bang, he gets on the steam tractor and that's it. Nothing else, is there?
Richard and I did talk a little bit about this, and the kind of whole changing plot and the fairies and the two kingdoms and everything like that. It's very operatic. And what happens at the end of one of these incredibly confusing operas is everybody gathers on stage and sings a sextet or an octet even very loudly, and nobody can understand what they're saying, and that's at the end. So it's you never get that kind
it was opera. I thought it was Shakespeare.
Shakespeare and opera. So if you have an opera of a Shakespeare play, that's a bullseye. So Midsummer Night's Dream, the opera is would end like that.
Well, Richard and I know what's coming in The Hanging Tree, although we will have to reread it in more depth than we did about 3 or 4 years ago. But Jan and Jenny, what are your hopes and expectations for the next instalment of Rivers of London?
Back to London, back to the Folly. Peter and Beverly still hooked up, more bodies. I don't think we're going to get the full Leslie story for a while, but we'll get drips of it, I think. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm also looking forward to going back to London, but also I would really, really like to have more of Leslie in the next book actually appearing, so that we can find out what's been going on and how that's developed. And I guess that depends how much time has elapsed. I've also become very intrigued how they're talking about in this book, the parallel worlds, and how we need to get more of an agreement. We may see more of that, the sort of two worlds, how they're going to manage alongside one another and being accepting and perhaps understanding a bit more about what goes on in one another's universe.
Yeah, Jennie talks about aspects of the plot being revealed drip by drip across the book. And there's a moment in this particular novel where we almost pull back the fourth wall, and Peter says, "So Molly was Fae, or even better, this particular kind of Fae, whatever this kind of Fae was. And so we progress in our knowledge of the universe, step by step, pebble by pebble." And in a way, that's exactly how the books are revealing the characters to us.
And which makes them it makes them so compulsively readable, because you know that this is a long series. And it's not over yet.
So thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please send us feedback by email at follypodcast@gmail.com, or leave a comment on our website, thefollycast.com. As Richard says, the next episode will be looking at Book 6, The Hanging Tree, and we'll be back talking about this in mid-October.
The Follycast theme you've been hearing is called London is Inspired by Cutwater, and links to their site are in the show notes. Be seeing you.